Hello, this is the last of four videos we've put together as part of an advanced workshop on systematic quantitative literature reviews. And that complements the original four videos that were put online about this method. And this is where we're incorporating feedback and developments in the method and where there were the challenging places, where were the straightforward ways, and how people can value add to their review. And this is one where we're going to go through reviewers' comments. What are the issues that reviewers sometimes bring up? How can you deal with those, even by incorporating the information in the original paper? As mentioned, this is because the systematic quantitative lit review is a relatively new method, and particularly in this way of expressing it, where you're mapping the discipline. You're identifying here be dragons, where there are key gaps in the literature, where there is literature. So it's systematic, quantitative, comprehensive, and structured. And of course, there's the website, Google or search for that using whatever search mechanism you want to online. Identify systematic quantitative lit review Griffith. There's the support site, increasingly putting information up there. The other videos, examples of papers using it, databases, etc., links to important other information about reviews, and of course our original papers. If you go and publish them, keen for you to cite us, add you to the web page, allow other people to see how people have used this method, expanded on it, etc. And this video is based on getting feedback from people about our experience publishing them and your experience using it as well. So we've found if there are issues raised by reviewers, they tend to be about these points. And these are some possible responses. So the first one is, why using only English language? And the response to that can be, most research is in English. But I always say, if you're fabulous and can speak more than one language, do feel free to actually do a literature review where you search for the literature in more than one language, because that's a really important service of allowing information to be shared beyond the boundaries of single languages and sharing that. So please go for it. Unfortunately, I'm monolingual, so mine stay only in English. Why only journal articles? Why not grey literature? Well, common response here is that it's not necessarily the same standard of work in the details, the methods, results, etc. The papers of the grey literature often hasn't been through a peer-reviewed process, and they're not as consistently available as papers are via online search engines. So when you're searching them and you're trying to say this is all the literature, you're much more potentially saying this is all literature that is available from these search engines, and that can be very heavily influencing what you can find. Then another one was, why was a specific paper not included? And sometimes you get this back from a reviewer, and you have to hope that the answer is going to be that you need to just provide a bit more clarification around the criteria used for inclusion and exclusion for the systematic component of the methods. It's always that fear, is it that it should have been in there and you missed it? So hopefully if you've done a really good job around that systematic search, that's not going to be the issue. Then there are other questions as, why not a meta-analysis? Because a lot of people tend to associate systematic with meta-analysis. Now, there are two responses around this. Often it's going to be there are not enough suitable data sets for a meta-analysis. And that's what we find in many discipline areas. There simply isn't yet enough to be able to do it. But if there are, via your systematic literature review and systematic quantity, you'd identified a subset of papers that would be enough for a meta-analysis, you can always go and have a look at using that method. Why not other topics? Common issue with reviewers, they love your paper and then they go, but why didn't you also look at this or this, etc. Now, generally at that point, maybe a better strategy is to say, this is an important issue, but it's for others reviewers to look at beyond the scope of the current study. The review is bland or pedestrian. Now, that can occur because you just got exhausted, and when you ended up writing it, particularly around the results and discussion, you just said there's this, there's this, there's this, and not go back to that basic idea that I always talk about when you've done your analysis, saying, okay, what's the most important thing I found, who's the most important audience for it, and why is it important? And you've got to be able to always do that before you start writing. So you might need to provide more context around the discussion, around the review and the meaning and importance of the results. The nature of this response depends on what's in your review. So see if you might need a little bit more work to fully examine the importance, limitations, etc. of the work that you've done. Now here are some examples of responses and papers that have dealt with that issue up front. So here's one to do with what was included, where it was only peer-reviewed journals. And what they've said is it's because that reflects the interests and values of the mainstream research communities, and they have a degree of control and credibility through the peer review process. They note that the identified publications therefore are unlikely to reflect the full scope of work in the field, and they're highlighting that they were only able to access papers written in English. And they're cognizant that relevant publications could appear in a number of different journals indexed in different databases. Nevertheless, they're saying their selection of databases was informed by the advice from these university librarians, go university librarians, that preliminary searches and careful review of individual titles. And so they say, while peer-reviewed journals are the most common, reliable and current dissemination of methods of research on embedding on this topic, may also be published in other formats. So they're dealing with that limitations and benefits of the approach of what they went fishing for, original research papers in English. Here's another example where this is one I was involved in, where we're looking at a particular topic and we're saying again, we're only focused on peer-reviewed academic journals because there was a consistent sampling method to identify the literature, contains similar levels of detail about the study and standards of research. It follows on the approach from other reviews, and we did that while recognising that their research on that topic could occur in other academic journals, in other languages, and a range of grey literature, and examples of what some of those were. Reviewing the non-English peer journals, however, was beyond the expertise of the authors. And then we quote, as more than 90% of science papers in English, including papers in other languages, may not dramatically alter the general patterns found in the current review, apart from those relating to the geographical spread of the studies. We also then said we didn't include grey literature because much of this literature can be very specific to certain regions or problems, is often not publicly available and hence included in online search databases. And also there can be less consistency in the detail provided within the grey literature about how the research was conducted and the data analysed, and the work has often not been subject to peer review. But we then say future reviews encompassing such grey literature are likely to provide important insights for certain regions, although consistency across grey literature globally remains a challenge. Now, the next thing that's really important is that, particularly around the geography of your study, if you've looked at that as the issue, you'll often find that there are important gaps. And this gets to an issue called about the demand versus the supply of literature on a topic. So let's have a look at this, because it's possible in your discussion to actually go into a more in-depth analysis around that. And you can actually calculate the demand and need for research compared to what's available. So this was this study that we looked at abstracts from a conference. And what we did is we said, okay, there were 750 abstracts across the thing, and 72% of them were from Europe. And that's not surprising considering that the conferences were held in Europe. But what we then did is saying this is about people visiting protected areas, PA, protected areas abbreviation. And so what we did is said, okay, how much of the global area of protected areas is represented by Europe? So what percentage of protected areas? It's 14%, but it's 72% of the papers. So then we divided the abstracts by the area of protected areas and said, hey, hang on, if this was evenly spread over all the protected areas, then we'd expect 0.0368 abstracts per 1,000 kilometres protected areas. In Europe, we've got a much higher proportion. Then we went down and said, okay, there are some countries in the world that have got really big protected area systems globally. As you can see, Brazil, China, Russia, Australia, USA and Canada. Massive large protected areas, but they're very underrepresented in the literature in this conference. And so this is nearly actually a way of saying the demand for the literature, if you're making it per area of protected areas, is high for these countries. The availability of literature is low for these, and therefore highlighting the need to target papers and studies from these particular locations, China and Brazil being obvious ones here. And this is a really neat way of trying to do it. We also looked at it the number of visitors to protected areas. But can you see how this is comparing demand versus need for research supply? Then we included in the paper a thing about, well, what are the factors that may affect the supply of research? Why was there more research from certain places than others? And so we put some arguments in here and some references that are going to apply to many studies that use this type of method, because we find these geographical biases are common. And that is saying, in terms of supply factors, what determines the fact we get a large supply of research from Europe and from the USA, but not from these other countries. And they include, there are more researchers and research funding in the USA and wealthier parts of Europe. So if you've got more researchers and more research funding, you're going to have more papers. There's also the dominance of the English language in academic publishing. There's often a higher rate of citation impact for American journals. And there's also a social, if you've got more people doing more research in the US, there's going to be more people to cite the papers in American journals. But there's also literature that says there are social biases affecting the perceptions regarding the importance of research from different regions and languages. And that's a really important thing for us as researchers to consider. And what we end up saying is that all 4 of these factors are important, and their impact on academia in general is increasingly recognised. So, really important set of points to make here about those why we need more research from some locations, but why we may not have that at the moment. And then we have to talk about why is the demand not equaling supply a problem. Whatever the reasons, the implication of this and similar reviews, it's important. It affects the context and interpretation of the research by underrepresenting some countries and regions despite their importance. Addressing these issues involves recognising that it occurs, so any interpretation of the literature is cognizant of the biases, providing funding and support for researchers and researchers in areas currently poorly represented in the literature, supporting the publication and presentation at conferences and in journals of work beyond those USA and wealthy parts of Europe, and doing so will foster a more geographically, socially and politically balance to our understanding of that topic. So you can see this is a really important point to make and will occur in many of the reviews. So hopefully that deals with some of the, well, hopefully knowing about this and including information about this actually in your original paper means you don't have those problems and those questions arriving from the reviewer. If you do get ones where reviewers are highlighting particular issues about the method, do let us know. We're really keen to improve on the method, improve on the information about the method, and help people deal with those challenges. It's about recognising what this review method does, what it doesn't do, and how it complements meta-analysis and narrative reviews. So thank you very much all those people who've been involved in doing those reviews. You're adding to the richness of our experience, and hopefully we can now, by doing this, share the benefits of your experiences and how you've improved and expanded on this method. And as always, hopefully soon this will be you. Thank you very much.